And take it away, Muki. You're on mute, Muki.
Okay, great to see you all. I'm just going to share my screen, and okay, that's good. Thumbs up.
Yes.
Okay, good. So the topic of today's session is a new normalization in the Middle East, ? And the question mark is there because something's definitely happening. Is it a normalization? Is it new? That's a little bit of what we're going to talk about now. But before we talk about what's new, we're going to do a historical run through of what led up to modern developments. This is a map that I would have grown up with, and looking at most of you, the map that many of you would have had as well, a map where you have to look really, really hard to see where the Israeli flag is. The Israeli flag, the state of Israel, in the middle over here, surrounded by all of these very, very big Muslim states, most of them Arab states, but also stretching to Pakistan, or stretching, including Iran, including Turkey. This was the region, and of course, that is not what it looks like today. Today, map looks like this, and I haven't even included Turkey, which does have relations with Israel, but is in a whole. If anything, Turkey is moving in the opposite direction to all the other nations on the map. And we can see that Israel has relations with all of those countries that are official relations. All of those countries that are marked in a reddish pinkish color, that you can see the dates on them. So that would be Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey, which we still have relations with. There are also a whole lot of unofficial relationships with other countries in the region. In fact, much of what happened when we achieved relations with, for example, United Arab Emirates was unofficial relations brought to the level of official relations. So we're going to talk about how we got to this map, how they're different, and what the future may hold for us. Let's listen. You know what? I have to go back. I'm sorry. I'm going to reshare because I didn't click the sound button on that. Okay, are you seeing the sharing?
There will be no separate peace between Israel and the Arab world. I want to make that very clear to all of you. I've heard several prominent politicians in Israel sometimes saying, well, the Arab world's in a different place now. We just have to reach out to them and we can work some things with the Arab world and we'll deal with the Palestinians. No, 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 and no. I can tell you that, reaffirmed even in the last week as I have talked to leaders of the Arab community. There will be no advance and separate peace with the Arab world without the Palestinian process and Palestinian peace. Everybody needs to understand that.
To be key.
Yeah, but it depends, Jeff. I think it really is a question.
So when I did that, folks, I lost your faces. I'm assuming that someone just tell me you can still hear and everything is good.
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'm not seeing you. I don't know what happened there, but I want to press on. So we just heard John Kerry, who was Secretary of State. This interview was in the towards the latter end of the second Obama administration, and what he voiced was not an unusual opinion. It was the mainstream opinion, and I would say that it was an opinion shared by many in Israel as well, in that our relations with the Arab world, certainly since 1948, were depending, or certainly since the breakthrough with Egypt, were dependent on resolving the Palestinian issue. That was going to open up our relations with the rest of the Arab world. That, of course, was wrong. This is an image that will be less familiar, I'm imagining, to many of you. This is a picture of what was called the Agranat Commission. The Agranat Commission, led by Chief Justice Agranat, was a commission appointed after the Yom Kippur War by the State of Israel to investigate the debacle of the state of the Yom Kippur War, to investigate the fact that Israel had failed to prepare adequately for the war. And the bottom line, they came up with a whole book of recommendations. The bottom line was that Israel had an operating assumption. They had just won a war 6 years before. The operating assumption was that we were victorious, that the Arab world were on its knees, and we didn't spend much time checking out other alternatives. And if there was one lesson that came out of 73, that came out of the Granite Commission, was that we need to always check our assumptions. We need to always make sure that the standing assumption is not challenged, or that the things that we've for a long time assumed don't work could actually work. And what was the standing assumption? The standing assumption was that the way to resolve the conflict in the area was to divide the country between the people. This is a map from 1947, the 29th of November, 1947. The blue area was going to be the Jewish state. The apricot colored area was going to be the Arab state. The white area was going to be an international state. That was the idea before the war. Immediately after the war, Israel takes the whole area that's colored beige. Jordan will take the area marked Samaria and Judea, which is the west bank of the Jordan River. And Egypt will take the Gaza Strip down in the south. And that is the map that Israel has from 48 to 67. In 67, Israel will take the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and also the Golan Heights, which are not really relevant for our discussion at the moment. And the theory is that until we return those territories, give up land, we won't achieve peace. Land for peace. Land for peace becomes the principle through which we see things, and Israel will give land to the Palestinians and gain peace. Indeed, it's not just to the Palestinians. The first breakthrough in the region, in the time of President Carter's administration, the 26th of March, 1979, Menachem Begin, representing Israel, Anwar Sadat from Egypt, sign a peace treaty in which Israel returns all of the Sinai Peninsula, an area 3 times the size of Israel, the principle of land for peace. And that is a peace that has still been around since 1979. That is a peace that survived an Islamist government in Egypt. That is a peace with our most powerful neighbor, an enormous country, 10 times the size population of we are, the long border with us. We have a peace with Egypt. It is a strategically important peace. We have military cooperation with Egypt. We have no normalization. There was a time when Israeli tourists went to Egypt. That is less and less today. Very few Egyptians came to Israel. There is no normalization. Next peace treaty that we have is the treaty that we see between Prime Minister Rabin and King Hussein of Jordan during the Clinton administration on the 26th of October, 1994. And this is with a country that we share a very, very long border with. Once again, a border that I used to do reserve duty on this border. I did reserve duty before the Jordanian peace treaty, and I did reserve duty afterwards. The sense when we did reserve duty along that border was that there are a row of Israeli soldiers and a row of Jordanian soldiers, both sets of soldiers east Then looking east to make sure no one attacks Israel either, because they weren't expecting an attack from us. Israeli tourists go to Jordan, Petra, Wadi Rum. Very few Jordanians come to Israel. Incredibly significant, quiet border, lack of conflict, no real normalization. And the last of the peace treaties was the Oslo process, which never really even reaches the final stage of a treaty between Rabin and Peres representing Israel and Yasser Arafat. This is actually a picture from the Nobel ceremony, the Oslo process in 93 and 94. And the idea was that Israel would return territories and enable the creation of a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank. Now you'll notice the green line separates the West Bank from Israel, and the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, or the territories, or the occupied territories, or the liberated territories, what you call it is already an indication of what you may be thinking of it, is divided into three areas called A, B, and C. Area A, marked in red, is autonomous, an autonomous Palestinian area, full Palestinian control. Area B, marked in gray, I like to say Balagan, or between. Area B is the part of the country where the Palestinians control everything except security, which Israel controls. Area C, the area that's still colored green, is the area in which Israel has complete control. And the idea of Oslo was that gradually the gray areas would become contiguous, gradually the gray areas would turn red, and a Palestinian state would come in, Israel having given territory. That idea elapses during the so-called Second Intifada in the year 2000. And for more than 20 years, process has never ended. It's festered on with tensions and violence between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And as I said, the theory that until we resolve this, nothing else can be resolved. Gaza Strip as well is now under separate control to the West Bank. The Gaza Strip is under Hamas control. So even, cynics in Israel would say it's not a two-state solution, it's a three-state solution. There'll be one state down in the Gaza Strip, another state in the West Bank, and Israel in order to achieve some kind of peace, not only with the Palestinians, but with the region. That all changed. The major source of the change, most analysts in the region believe, is Iran. Iran that has aspirations to be a nuclear state. Iran that has aspirations to be the dominant Muslim state in the region. Iran that is playing a destabilizing role in all of those countries that you can see. And this is a French map. The reason I wanted it is because it shows the spider web, all these different connections between Iran and different countries in the region that Iran is destabilizing. And I draw your attention to United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and these countries here that are much, much closer to Iran than to Israel. And Israel is to Iran, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. One other important piece, most of the states in the Middle East, the exception, Turkey, Israel, Egypt, and Iran, are colonial creations. In other words, they don't have a history. Iran, Persia, the time of the Bible, has a long, long history going back to the time of the Bible. Egypt has a long, long history going back to the time of the Bible. Jewish connections to the land of Israel, and also the Turks going back not quite as long, but going back to the Ottoman Empire. All of the rest of the countries are split along ethnic lines, split along religious lines, the major groups being the Sunni and the Shiites. That's the main groups within Islam. Now, if you look at the bottom, you'll see that only 16% of Muslims, Shia, and 83% of Muslims are Sunni. That's a little misleading because in the Middle East, it's 40-60. If you don't include the Indonesians and the Pakistanis and the Muslim stans, the former Soviet Asian states, which are all Sunni, then we have a very different picture. And part of Iran is interested in Shiite pride, in strengthening the Shiites wherever they may be, and that has been a major disruption in the area. Hang on a bit, we went too fast there. Now, what happened with the Arab Spring, or as we say in this part of the world, the so-called Arab Spring, was a collapse of these fictional states. When I say fictional, these states that were created by colonial powers and worked as long as they were colonial powers. When the British left, when the French left, when the Italians left, these states were held together by strongmen. That's Muammar Gaddafi that we see in the picture, or Saddam Hussein, or any of the other strongmen that ruled these countries, who could suppress the different ethnic groups, who could suppress the different Shiites, Sunnis, whoever it happened to be. Once the Arab Spring came, it got rid of the rulers. There was no clear sense of people feeling Libyan, people feeling Iraqi, of people feeling Syrian. People went back to their base identities. They were Sunni, they were Shiite, they were Druze, they were Alawite. And in this chaos, we have the development of the radical Sunni groups, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, who for a while were taking over control of some of those states, a group of people who want to take Islam back to its most medieval form, a group of people intolerant not only of Druze or Christians, but even of Shiites, and even of secular or Sunnis that are not quite Muslim enough. This was part of the chaos. Those countries that hadn't collapsed, like the Gulf states, looked around and saw what the Arab Spring was bringing. Perhaps the biggest disrupting factor in the region was what we call the JCPOA. JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran deal, was the major factor that destabilized the Middle East. Iran was trying to become nuclear and also to have a delivery system to send those nuclear weapons wherever they needed them to be. And an arrangement was reached between Russia, the United Kingdom, the United States, China, France, Germany, and Iran, called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This map is the way many in the region viewed it. Iran single-handedly managed to cope with and draw a great deal against six so-called serious powers in the world. Now, in Israel, there was a lot of unhappiness with the Iran deal. There were voices who said it's a bad deal. But in fairness, there are also voices in Israel, people from the high-ranking intelligence and security services who say we can cope with a nuclear Iran. They're not the mainstream voice, but there are such voices, respectable voices. That is not the situation in Saudi Arabia. That is not the situation in the Gulf states. Saudis actually went even further. And their view is that the Iran deal put through a trusted ally way to make a deal with the devil. And the Iran deal was very, very, very unpopular in the Gulf states. Remember, they're much, much closer to Iran. They're much more vulnerable in that they didn't have a three-tier missile defense. We have short-term, medium-term, and long-term anti-missile defenses. They're very successful. We haven't used the one for incoming ballistic missiles yet, thank God. We have one. The Gulf states don't have any of this. And they were very, very unhappy with the last few months of the Obama administration. And already then, there were significant breakthroughs. Had already been an underlying relationship between Israel and the Gulf states. There were significant breakthroughs between us and Gulf states at that point, because they began to understand it's about interests that are more important. And their interest in surviving a nuclear Iran was more important than their interest in the establishment of a Palestinian state. After President Obama comes President Trump. And President Trump is someone that I'm not talking about what the man in the street or the woman in the street feels about President Trump. I'm talking about what professional echelons didn't know how to work with him. Professional echelons in security services, intelligence services in the region are used to dealing with policy, are used to being icebergs where only a small part of what's going on is made public and most of it remains secret. Suddenly they found themselves coping with a president, firstly, didn't have long-term policies, and secondly, that you couldn't share intelligence with because you didn't know who was going to get that intelligence further on. That being said, they also found an administration not interested in sticking to the accepted norms of the way things had been done, but looking to try different things, looking to reevaluate what had been principles in the region, and the combination of the JCPOA and the Trump administration opened a whole lot of doors in the region. There was also an understanding in the Arab world, already in the dying days of the Obama administration, when Netanyahu vociferously attacked the JCPOA, there was also an understanding in the Gulf states that Netanyahu was no longer part of the problem. In fact, Netanyahu could be part of the solution. So let's now take a moment to look at the Gulf states themselves. The United Arab Emirates is a group of 7 small kingdoms, emirates, banded together. The biggest of them is Abu Dhabi. Very small states that were part, believe it or not, of the Raj of India during the British rule, and later on became so-called crucial states. There was a treaty that created these states, and when Britain leaves the area, they become independent. They decide to band together as one country. For a while, it looked like Oman and Qatar were also going to be part of it. In the end, they do not join. And the United Arab Emirates does very, very well out of oil. Now, important to understand, this is a Sunni Muslim state. It was never at war with Israel. And so when we look at our relationship with Egypt and our relationship with Jordan, where we have peace no normalization, there are Egyptians, there are Jordanians who lost fathers and grandfathers in wars against Israel. There is personal grievance, perhaps. Whereas with the Gulf states, there is no personal grievance. There was no war with Israel. There's another factor. That factor is a new generation of leadership. This is MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, not to be confused with MBS, who is the Saudi leader. We'll get to talk about him in a few minutes. This man is in his 50s, but has already been a ruler for a while. And his idea is the oil is going to end. Since oil is going to end, I need to take my country into the future based on something else. And we already know that Dubai has become a destination, with water parks and theme parks, and it's become a tourist destination, a vacation destination. You can buy alcohol there. You can wear a bikini there. So he was interested in normalization, and he was interested in finding a way to cope with the threat from the Saudis. And he was the first one to take the unofficial relations with Israel. Let's be absolutely clear. These relations could not have been made public without Saudi blessing. And if there was any doubt about the Saudi opinion, we now know that you can fly on El Al or Israel, or not only on the UAE carriers, directly from Israel to the UAE over Saudi Arabia, and it's absolutely legitimate. And in fact, on the very first Israel Air flight, those two people that you see in front are my wife's sister, her husband, my sister-in-law and brother-in-law. Israelis have been flocking to the UAE for vacation. It was one of the places we could go to during this COVID crisis. Right now, we haven't been able to go anywhere for the last 6 weeks, but today I was invited to a training seminar on the 25th of April, the 30th of April in the UAE. Because one of the companies that I do a lot of guiding for have already pointed out that there are lots and lots of American groups who, when they come back, want to combine Israel and the UAE on their next trip. And this is a normalization, not just a peace. Israelis go there, and we've already had a number of people coming from the Gulf states to Israel as well. Less for tourists, but a lot for business, a lot of high tech. And there is a large class in the United Arab Emirates of workers who are mostly not from there, but from Pakistan or from other states. There are also many middle-class people and affluent people who will be the natural partners who want to come to Tel Aviv and to play in Israel. The next group to make peace with us and to normalize us with us were Bahrain. Bahrain is a very small island off the coast of Saudi Arabia, connected by a highway. You can see on the map the highway that connects Bahrain to Saudi Arabia. They also signed the peace treaty on August the 13th, 2020. Bahrain has a large Shiite population. Bahrain is very close to Iran because it's actually in the middle of the Gulf, not like the United Arab Emirates, which is a bit further away. And the king of Bahrain, Mohammed bin Isa al Khalifa, also decided to join into the peace treaty along with UAE and with normalization. If I said the UAE would do nothing without the Saudi blessing, then all the more so Bahrain, which is completely dependent on the Saudis for many of the goods and services that come into Bahrain. Both of these countries are talking about a normalization. Both of these countries have no history of conflict with Israel. Both of these countries are interested in technological and security connections with Israel because they feel the Iranian threat. And just a reminder, we see the whole region. There's the United Arab Emirates, there's Bahrain, here is Iran. And to fly from Israel to either of those places, can't fly over Iraq or Syria or Iran. So we could fly either the whole way around Saudi Arabia, which would be ridiculous. And of course, now we're allowed to fly directly to those countries. So the leader of Saudi Arabia officially is still King Salman, but his son, Mohammed bin Salman, is the official leader. He's a man in his 30s, really, really young leader for this part of the world where typically the leader was an old man. He also understands both the Iranian threat and that the world is changing and that he needs to change world to keep up. He's a little clumsy. He's done some things that have antagonized the West. I will say that in Israel, we're watching in amazement this whole Khashoggi blowback against MBS. Seems like the issue that the West has is that security services killed someone clumsily. Had they done it discreetly, like the CIA doing it, or like MI5 is doing it, or like the Mossad is doing it, then there may have been less of an issue. But because he did it in a messy way, the world seems to be upset. Way Israel understands the UAE, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia is that these are strongmen. These are dictators who are pro-Western. And you need to keep your eyes on the essence, which is their pro-Westernness, more than their lack of democracy in those countries, and hope that the engagement with the West will gradually nudge them in the right direction, rather than being in the Soviet orbit as they were before, or in the Iranian orbit as they may still be. There's a completely different story. And by the way, we don't have official relations with Saudi Arabia just yet, but everyone is talking about the when, not if. The sense is that we have long-standing negotiations with the Iranians, with the Saudis, because of their fear of the Iranians, and that's not going to go away. The next country is very, very different. This, again, the green circle is around Israel. Yellow circle, the yellow country is Sudan. Sudan was once just part of Egypt during the British period. It becomes a separate country. This is a country that we have fought wars with. Sudan sends soldiers to fight in the wars against Israel. Sudan was the site of the infamous Khartoum conference after the Six-Day War, in which Moshe Dayan said, we will give you full withdrawal from the territories that we had conquered in 1967 for full recognition. And the Khartoum conference issued the infamous 3 no's: no recognition, no negotiation, no peace. Sudan's motivation is not Iran. Sudan's motivation was that Sudan wants to be removed from the state sponsor of terrorism list. Now, Sudan was for many, many years ruled by a military leadership, and it now has a transitional sovereignty council, which is made up of 6 civilians and 5 soldiers to have a 3-year term to move the country from the regime that it used to have into a country that will be a democracy and ready to rule itself. Written into their 3-year period is that none of them are able to continue under the new regime. In other words, they really are meant to be a transitional period. It's deliberately 6 civilians, 5 soldiers. He made a distinct effort of including a woman. One of the women is a Christian. So a real sense to create a new Sudan. The leading personality, the gentleman sitting in the middle, Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah Abdel-Rahim al-Burhan, is very serious about this. Had the Trump administration not agreed to move them from the state sponsor of terrorism list, it's not sure what would happen. It's not sure who they're talking for, if whoever replaces them afterwards will honor these agreements. There are no Israelis going to play in the Sudan, but it's another country in the region. It's also a country in a very poor state on every possible measure that you look at. But there is a hope that it's another country and other countries in the region would be inspired, because it's no longer just Egypt or just Egypt and Jordan, but more and more countries that are joining this story. The last country that I'm going to look at now is Morocco. Morocco had relations with Israel in the period of the Oslo Accords. Morocco is also our biggest ethnic minority in Israel, Moroccan Jews. They reckon close to 1 million Israelis are descendants of people who came from Morocco, who have a ethnic identity or connection to Morocco. Morocco is also far away. It's the furthest away of the countries that we have. Morocco did actually send soldiers to fight in one of the wars with us. But it was already possible to go to Morocco on an Israeli passport, even though we didn't have official relations. And actually, in the days following the trip that many of you were on this time last year, I actually did a preparation session, a 2-day preparation session in Tel Aviv, learning about Morocco, getting ready to start taking groups to Morocco. So we were taking groups to Morocco. There was a relationship, but now that has been raised to a completely different level. And once again, what was it that made Morocco cross from this unofficial relationship to a much more official relationship? It was getting the Trump administration to recognize Western Sahara, which was occupied by Morocco, to be part of Morocco, to recognize their occupation. And King Mohammed was prepared to come out publicly. Again, there were already links with Israel because of the American promise to recognize Western Sahara. So we can see we've looked at 4 different countries, and the Saudis in some kind of intermediate status, different reasons. What has happened in all of them is that it is becoming acceptable for nations in the region to say we have a relationship with Israel. There's a great irony with Morocco. They want their occupation of Western Sahara to be recognized while still paying lip service to their condemnation of Israel's occupation, as they call it, of the West Bank. Now, before we go on to one last issue, I'm just going to divert for a moment to 2 European leaders. They may be familiar to you. We have Viktor Orban, who is the leader of Hungary, and Andrzej Duda, who is the leader of Poland. I will confess that for the last couple of years, I have felt very uneasy about Israel's relationship with these 2 countries and with these 2 men who I see as not Democrats, who I see or as being they're still having elections, but doing their best to undermine democracy, we should be very, very clear. Not one of the countries, not the countries we made peace with in the 70s or the 80s, and not those that we've made peace with or normalized in the last couple of months, come anywhere close to being as democratic as these two countries. There's a certain paradox. If we want to make peace with the countries in the region, we have to recognize that we're making peace with countries that are not democracies. We have to recognize that we're making peace. We're normalizing. We're going to go and play in Dubai, where basic social rights are denied to many, many of the people. Let's watch this movie.
Amiran, are you ready? Shalom לכולם. אני בסעודיה. השלום בדרך. Hello everyone. I am in Saudi Arabia. Peace is on the way. כולנו מאמינים באלוהים.
Salam alaikum. Amiran from Israel. Muhammad and me. אנחנו מאמינים, בני מאמינים. Muhammad, are you ready?
אנחנו מאמינים בני מאמינים.
אנחנו מאמינים בני מאמינים.
ואין לנו על מי להישען.
ואין לנו על מי להישען.
אלו על אבינו.
אלא על אבינו.
אבינו שבשמיים.
1, 2, 3, go!
אנחנו מאמינים בני מאמינים. ואין לנו על מי להישען. אלו על אבינו. אבינו שבשמיים. אנחנו מאמינים בני מאמינים. ואין לנו על מי להישען. אלו על אבינו. אבינו שבשמיים. אנחנו מאמינים בני מאמינים. אנחנו מאמינים בני מאמינים. ואין לנו על מי להישען. ואין לנו על מי להישען. אלו על אבינו. אלו על אבינו. אבינו שבשמיים. אנחנו מאמינים בני מאמינים. ואין לנו על מי להישען.
So these two people, Aviram Dvir is a Israeli recording artist. I had never heard of him because he plays in the Israeli, he's an ultra-Orthodox performer. His music is widely listened to in the ultra-Orthodox sectors. And Mohammed Saud is a Saudi blogger and performer. They found each other, they got together, they recorded this song, which is the kind of song that gets played at Orthodox weddings. When men are dancing together on one side and women are dancing together on the other side, this is a song you often have. They chose to record the song, which has got airtime in Saudi Arabia, in the Gulf states, and in Israel. Really a sense of the coming messianic age. The last site that I want to show you is that the Palestinian question hasn't gone away. We may have this optimism with the Gulf states, with even Saudi Arabia. The West Bank, Gaza remain issues that have not been resolved. Einstein used to say that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, hoping for different results. Many people say that although the motivation for at least some of the normalizations and peace treaties that Israel has with these new countries may be questionable, perhaps this is a new angle to try and solve this issue. The issue is not gone away. It's not going away. But perhaps we can solve it not by using the old paradigms, but instead by creating a normalization of relations between Israel and the Gulf states. And I will remind you in closing that Israel had threatened to annex parts of the West Bank. And that has been removed from the agenda following as part of the peace treaty with and normalization treaty with the UAE. So perhaps instead of a stick, is going to be more of a carrot. And the conventional wisdom is that additional countries are going to climb onto the bandwagon. I think people are waiting to see how the Biden administration will play this. It's quite clear that President Biden is focusing internally on the COVID crisis in the United States right now. Who's going to be next? Some say Oman. Some say even Saudi Arabia. It's not, I can't answer that for sure, but one of them will be. So I'm going to stop share, and then I'll be happy in the last few minutes to take any questions if there are.
Okay, does anyone have a question?